Welcome to this ChessGuin opening lesson. In this video, we are going to look at the final and most important part of the Ruy Lopez repertoire, the closed Spanish with castles kingside. This is where black keeps the Marshall Gambit option available. So instead of entering the main line with c3, we choose the practical anti-Marshall move a4. Finally, we arrived at the main theme of the repertoire. Castle first allows black to follow up with the Marshall Gambit after c3 d5. Black still has the option of d6, and since in modern times, 7th d6 is almost always followed by castle anyway, we play a4 instead of c3 main line. This is the anti-Marshall variation, Garry Kasparov's choice. Black's b5 pawn has come under attack, and its defense by the a6 pawn is only illusory, as that pawn will be pinned along the a-file after a pawn takes b5. So he cannot really play d5 like in the Marshall Gambit. Black must take other moves to defend it. Capturing on a4 would be an undesirable way out, because bishop takes a4 in response would renew the pressure on the c6 knight. Let's see what happens if black moves d5. We take the b5 instead of d5. Black can take on e4, also attacking our knight. We won a pawn, but black can continue his play in Marshall style. As in the original Marshall Gambit, here too, the bishop comes on d6. Then the knight tries to attack with g4 and the queen with h4. We stop the knight g4 with h3. Black's new plan is to bring the rook into the attack via rook e5. This is a significant difference compared to the usual Marshall, as we can activate the knight from c3 since our pawn is not there. We also bring the rook to attack the e4. It's not really possible to defend the pawn because in the case of a bishop f5, we can take the a6. Black can instead choose to continue the attack and take on h3. It would be quite risky to accept the sacrifice because then the rook g5 and the queen c8 would follow, attacking the difficult-to-defend h3 pawn, and there could be trouble around our king. So we simply ignore the sacrifice and capture the pawn on e4. Black still has activity in exchange for the pawn, but the engine also gives a clear advantage, and there is less risk in this position than in a Marshall Gambit. Knight a5 is met by a pawn takes b5 again. Black usually attacked the e4 here and led us to take on a6. The bishop goes back to win back the a-pawn. We cannot take the bishop due to the pin. We protect the pawn, the e5 is hanging, and we want to play d4 or b4, b5. Rook b8 is a more common move than the previous ones. We can take on b5 first. And now c3. Black solved the threat on b5, so he can continue the Marshall Gambit plan, or just play d6. We can call this an improved Marshall Gambit on white's part, as we have an open file. In the original Marshall, black usually plays c6, but here there is knight to f6 too. e2 is a better square for the rook, because after knight g4, h3, queen h4, we can play knight to d2, then f3, since the f2 pawn is protected by the rook. After c6, we'll continue, just like in a Marshall Gambit. We can't play h3, because black will sacrifice the bishop on h3. This was a game between Duda and Carlsen on the World Cup in 2021. White's plan is to move the queen to f1 to help in the defense. Duda did this with rook e4, then queen f1, but I proposed the queen d3, then f1 continuation. Black doesn't want to exchange the queens with pawn disadvantage. The knight is on its way to h4, so we can start exchanging pieces. And if the bishop comes to d3, we answers with bishop e2. After we have defended everything, we can exploit the open A file, which is a big difference compared to the Marshall. As I mentioned, black can play d6 instead of d5. We continue the usual Spanish play with d4. We have a good center and pieces. There's no need to be afraid of bishop takes f3. We'll take back with pawn, thus gaining the bishop pair, and there will be an opportunity for f4 e5 later. b4 is another main response after a4. White also has a few possible moves now, such as d4, c3, a5. But I prefer d3. Since b4 has arrived, the knight can even move to c4 from d2. The main move is knight a5, followed by the usual c5 plan. We start to attack black's pawn chain. Black prefers to defend e5 with queen c7 instead of taking on c3 or d4. The knight has reached c4, and the position is starting to look nice. The only really strong continuation from black is the b3 plan. Let's look at an example of this. First he attacks the queen. And now b3. Even now, even if black had moved it one move earlier, it is important to take on a5. The bishop looks bad, but the plan is to activate it via d3 then c4. Black has only one good move again to stop our plan. c4, and we lose some tempo, since this way the queen will be on c4. And the other idea behind the move is that black also activates his bishop on c5. We prevent the knight g4. Black got a pretty good position, but he had to play it precisely, and it's still not that easy, because if white somehow manages to develop the pieces, we can assert the material advantage. Finally, the most common continuation is bishop b7. Black still retains the option of d5. With white, the strategy after d3 is now as follows. Bishop d2 first defends the knight a5, then knight c3, from where it can go towards d5 or to g3 via the e2 square. If black responds with d5 instead of d6, it changes things a bit. Black again wants to come up with a continuation similar to the Marshall Gambit by sacrificing the e5 pawn. We take b5 and then a8 before winning the pawn. It's not really good to take back the e5. In the case of bishop d6, we could have taken on d5 with the rook. We are in a good position, as black does not have a dangerous attack here that can provide sufficient compensation. We will move c3 d4 and bring the knight to f3. Better choice is knight d4 instead of taking on e5. We defend the bishop with the knight, because we don't want to play c-pawn takes b3. We retreat the knight and try to exchange pieces. The knight was not in a good position on b3, but at least the pawn structure remained good. Now we move it to e4, and then we want to push d4. The move d5 wasn't really dangerous this time either. Let's go back to the move d6. The usual knight d2 is not a bad move either, but as I mentioned, I recommend continuing with bishop d2 and then knight c3. Black has a few options to continue here, but in most cases we can continue with the knight c3. These continuations can be found in the PGN. Now let's see what happens if he blocks the planned path of our knight with b4. We try to eliminate his pawn and free the c3 square. Rook b8 is probably the best continuation with black. It is a short-term pawn sacrifice, since after c-pawn takes b5, he just has to move his bishop from b7, and our b4 pawn is already undefended. c8 is better because it can go to g4 in some cases. We give the pawn back this way. We stop bishop g4 by pinning it. There is little initiative left in the position, but it is more equal. a5 also seems like a logical move for black to keep a pawn on b4. Now we can use the c3 move and continue with d4. We have a new plan. We will move the bishop from d2, giving the space to the knight, and we will be able to advance e5 later. After b-pawn takes c3, we can choose to take with knight or bishop. The logical one is, of course, the knight c3, which we will look at now, but taking with the bishop is also an interesting option, which you can find in PGN. Black plays his usual knight a5 c5 plan. We are used to the fact that in this early a4 variation, we prefer to go back to a2 with the bishop. And the knight arrived on d5. We don't let black to close the position with a5 and knight b4. Black needs to exchange the knight if he doesn't want our knight to jump into b6. It is important to take back with pawn to attack the knight. Knight d4 seems logical, but we'll capture it, and after e-pawn takes d4, we have b4, and after c-pawn takes d4, we have f4. Black can play also knight a7, and then go with the knight to b5. We continue with b4 again. The engine says this position is also equal, but I think white is much more active and has a clear initiative on the queenside. You can find the full PGN material on ChessGuin.com. The link is in the description.